Excuse me, are you Adam Graham?
The very same. And this is my old-time radio snack wagon.
Welcome to the Old-Time Radio Snack Wagon, where we serve up a bite-sized portion of old-time radio. And now, here's your Snack Wagon host, Adam Graham.
Today, our snack is a tie-in to our Amazing World of Radio Summer Series. Over on the Amazing World of Radio at amazing.greatdetectives.net, I'm presenting the Summer of Robert Louis Stevenson. In this series, I'm featuring old-time radio programs based on the works of Robert Louis Stevenson from a wide variety of different series. It occurred to me to find something bite-sized that I could play, perhaps a sketch from a story that didn't have a full-length adaptation. However, when I started to look into it, I couldn't find any sketch like that, but I also found that some of Stevenson's other works outside of his great stories were featured on old-time radio programs. I hoped perhaps to be able to feature some of his poetry, but I found something even more interesting. And once again, we are turning to Orson Welles, a bit sooner than I'd planned, but I trust you won't mind. This comes from Welles's Radio Almanac, a series that aired for 6 months over CBS in 1944. Radio Almanac was a variety program. Welles had had a brief run filling in for an ailing Jack Benny that left him interested in this sort of program. Like other variety programs, it featured music, jokes, and comedy sketches. However, it also regularly featured dramatic readings by Welles or by the guest star of the week. And on the May 24th episode, Welles read from one of Stevenson's lesser-known works. Stevenson had been living in Australia in February 1890 when he read something that caused him to leap to his feet, full of indignation. What he read so outraged him that he had to respond. At his own expense, he printed a pamphlet. And even though he feared it could lead to legal action, he had no choice but to publish it. Now to tell us more about it, here is Orson Welles.
Half a century ago, there was a Dr. Hyde who was a missionary in the South Seas and who's remembered today because he wrote a public letter to a reverend brother of his, a certain Dr. Gage. In this letter, Dr. Hyde attacked the character and memory of a Catholic priest who had died 2 years before in the leper colony at Molakai. This priest, Dr. Hyde declared, was dirty, coarse, headstrong, and bigoted, and not pure in his personal life. Now, this priest, whom Dr. Hyde called dirty and impure, was none other than the martyr, Father Damien, whose selfless devotion to his island parish was climaxed on that Sunday morning in 1885, when he commenced his sermon not with the accustomed words, "My brethren," but with the terrible and heart-rending address, "We lepers." Dr. Hyde's letter was printed in a Sydney newspaper, and that miserable cleric may well have regretted to his dying day that it was ever noticed by the literary gentleman whose answer I'm going to read to you now. Sydney, February 25th, 1890, to the Reverend Dr. C.M. Hyde, Beretania Street, Honolulu, Sir. You may remember that you have done me several courtesies, for which I am prepared to be grateful, but there are duties which come before gratitude, and offenses which justly divide friends. Your letter to the Reverend H.B. Gage is a document which, in my sight, if you had filled me with bread when I was starving, if you had sat up to nurse my father when he lay a-dying, would yet absolve me from the bonds of gratitude. You belong, sir, to a sect, I believe my sect, which has enjoyed and partly failed to utilize an exceptional advantage in the islands of Hawaii. This is not the place to enter into the degree or causes of their failure, but this much must be plainly dealt with. In the course of their calling, the missionaries, or too many of them, grew rich. It may be news to you that the houses of missionaries are a cause of mocking on the streets of Honolulu. It will at least be news to you that when I returned your civil visit, the driver of my cab commented on the size, the taste, and the comfort of your home on Baratania Street. No, your sect, and remember, as far as any sect avows me it is mine, has not done ill, in a worldly sense, in the Hawaiian kingdom. When calamity befell their innocent parishioners, when leprosy descended and took root in the islands, to that prosperous mission and to you, as one of its adornments, God sent at last an opportunity. I know that others of your colleagues look back on the inertia of your church and the intrusion and decisive heroism of Damien with something almost to be called remorse. I'm sure it is so with yourself. I'm persuaded your letter was inspired by a certain envy. But, sir, when we have failed and another has succeeded, when we have stood by and another has stepped in, when we sit and grow bulky in our charming mansions, and a plain, uncouth peasant steps into the battle under the eyes of God and succors the afflicted and consoles the dying, and is himself afflicted in his turn, and dies upon the field of honor, the battle cannot be retrieved. It is a lost battle, and lost forever. Your church and Damien's were in Hawaii upon a rivalry to do well. You having in one huge instance failed and Damien succeeded, I marvel it should not have occurred to you that you were doomed to silence. That when you had been outstripped in that high rivalry and sat inglorious in the midst of your well-being, in your pleasant rooms, and Damien, crowned with glories and horrors, toiled and rotted in that pigsty of his under the cliffs of Kalawao, you, the elect who would not, were the last man on earth to collect and propagate gossip on the volunteer who would and did. I think I see you, for I try to see you in the flesh as I write these sentences. I think I see you leap at the word pigsty. He was a coarse, dirty man. These were your own words. And you may think I am come to support you with fresh evidence. In a sense, it is even so. Damien has been too much depicted with a conventional halo. Such information as I have, I gathered on the spot from those who knew him well and long, who beheld him with no halo. These gave me what knowledge I possess, and I learnt it in the place itself, Kalawao, which you've never visited. You, I imagine, to be one of those persons who talk with cheerfulness of that place which oxen and wain ropes could not drag you to behold. You who do not even know its situation on the map probably denounce sensational descriptions, stretching your limbs the while in your pleasant parlor on Baratania Street. When I was pulled ashore there one early morning, there sat with me in the boat two sisters bidding farewell in humble imitation of Damien to the lights and joys of human life. One of these wept silently. I could not withhold myself from joining her. Had you been there, nature would have triumphed even in you. And as the boat drew nearer and you beheld the stairs crowded with abominable deformations of our common manhood, and you saw yourself landing in the midst of such a population as only now and then surrounds us in the horror of a nightmare, what a haggard eye you would have rolled over your reluctant shoulder toward the house on Baratania Street. Had you gone on, had you found every fourth face a blot upon the landscape, had you visited the hospital and seen the butt ends of human beings lying there, almost unrecognizable, but still breathing, still thinking, still remembering, you would have understood that life in the lazaretto is an ordeal from which the nerves of a man's spirit shrink, even as his eye quails under the brightness of the sun. You would have felt it was, even today, a pitiful place to visit and a hell to dwell in. And observe that which I saw and suffered was from a settlement purged, bettered, beautified. It was a different place when Damien came there and made his great renunciation and slept that first night under a tree amidst his rotting brethren, alone with pestilence, and looking forward with what courage, with what pitiful shrinkings of dread, God only knows, to a lifetime of dressing sores and stumps. You say that Damien was coarse. It's very possible you make us sorry for the lepers who had only a coarse old peasant for their friend and father. Damien was dirty, you say. Think of the poor lepers annoyed with this dirty comrade. Damien was headstrong. I believe you're right again, and I thank God for his strong head and heart. Damien was not sent to Molakai, but went there without orders. I have heard Christ in the pulpits of our church held up for imitation on the ground that his sacrifice was voluntary. Damien had no hand in the reforms, you say. If ever man brought reforms and died to bring them, it was he. There's not a clean cup or towel in the bishop home, but dirty Damien washed it. Damien, you say, was impure in his personal life. How do you know that? Is this the nature of the conversation in the house on Beretania Street, which the Camden envied, driving past racy details of the misconduct of the poor peasant priest toiling under the cliffs of Molakai? When I was there, I heard complaints of Damien. Why was this never mentioned? True, I'd heard it once before. I must tell you how. There came to Samoa from Honolulu one who in a public house on the beach volunteered that Damien had been guilty of misconduct and had sickened from having contact with lepers. The man sprang to his feet. I'm not at liberty to give his name, but from what I heard, I doubt if you would care to have him to dinner in Beretania Street. You miserable little, here's a word I dare not print, it would so shock your ears. If the story were 1,000 times true, he cried, can't you see you're 1,000,000 times lower for daring to repeat it? Reverend Sir, I'll suppose your story to be true. I will suppose, and God forgive me for supposing, that Damien faltered and stumbled in his narrow path of duty. I'll suppose that in the horror of his isolation, perhaps in the fever of disease, he, who was doing so much more than he had sworn, failed in the letter of his priestly oath. He, who was so much a better man than either you or me, who did what we would never dreamed of daring, he, too, tasted our common frailty. Oh, the pity of it. The least tender should be moved to tears, the most incredulous to prayer. And all that you could do was to pen your letter to the Reverend H.B. Gage. Is it growing at all clear to you what a picture you've drawn of your heart? You had a father. Suppose this tale were about him and some informant brought it to you, proof in hand. I'm not making too high an estimate of your emotional nature when I suppose you would regret the circumstance. That you would feel the tale of frailty the more keenly since it shamed the author of your days. And that the last thing you would do would be to publish it in the religious press. Well, the man who tried to do what Damien did is my father, and the father of the man in the public bar, and the father of all who love goodness. And he was your father, too, if God had given you the grace to see it. Signed, Robert Louis Stevenson.
Welcome back. Today, it's popular in our social media and clickbait age to use phrases like, so-and-so eviscerates or destroys someone to tease a social media clip or article. And when you watch the clip in its context, it's just a conversation or debate where there's a tense moment, but there's give and take, and no real destruction or evisceration occurred. Or it's a pretty good article, but that's about it. I think that this episode could legitimately be titled Robert Louis Stevenson Destroys C.M. Hyde, and it'd be accurate. Stevenson initially tried to have the letter published in the Sydney Morning Herald. They refused to do so on advice of legal counsel. Stevenson privately published it, and then it was picked up by British and American newspapers and eventually published in Australia by the Australian Star. Hyde never took any action. Perhaps he just wanted to put the incident behind him. He had not intended the letter to be publicly published. However, that doesn't make him virtuous. The defense, I was just spreading gossip, I didn't mean to have it attributed to me, isn't the defense you might think it is. Given Reverend Hyde's last name, many people on the internet have wondered whether Robert Louis Stevenson took the ultimate revenge and named one of his two most famous villains after Reverend Hyde. But no. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was released in 1886, 4 years before Stevenson wrote this letter. Of course, Stevenson's letter is more than a brilliant takedown. It's a powerful defense and a tribute to a man who dedicated himself to serving others under the most horrific conditions imaginable. Orson Welles does a beautiful job with his reading as usual. He had an unmatched power for bringing a great text to life and finding the emotion and truth of it. And I think this was another great performance by him. As for Damien, his memory and legacy in Hawaii live on. Father Damien Day is celebrated on April 15th each year in that state. Father Damien's statue stands at the entrance of the Hawaii State Capitol. A second cast of the statue is in the Statuary Hall collection at the United States Capitol as one of two representatives of the state of Hawaii, along with King Kamehameha. There was actually much more to Stevenson's letter than was excerpted here, although I think Wells did a good job capturing the spirit of it. But I will include a link to the full letter in the show notes. Among other things in the letter, Stevenson predicted that Father Damien of Molakai shall be named saint. This happened nearly 120 years later in 2009 when he was canonized as Saint Damien of Molakai by the Catholic Church. In his homily for the occasion, Pope Benedict XVI said, "Let us remember before this noble figure that it is charity which makes unity, which brings it forth and makes it desirable. Following in St. Paul's footsteps, St. Damien prompts us to choose the good warfare, not the kind that brings division, but the kind that gathers people together." It's time for me to close up the old snack wagon, but don't worry, we'll be back with another serving of old-time radio goodness before you know it. If you want to enjoy some of our longer-form podcasts, you can feast away at my website at greatdetectives.net. Your emails are also welcome at adam@snackwagon.net.
The Old Time Radio Snack Wagon comes to you from Boise, Idaho. Your host is Adam Graham. Sound production is by Rhines Media, LLC. You can listen to past episodes of the Old Time Radio Snack Wagon as well as connect on social media at our website at snackwagon.net. Email suggestions for episodes to adam@snackwagon.net. This has been the Old Time Radio Snack Wagon.
Until next time, goodbye.